Commas give most people trouble, and there are plenty of rules and exceptions to give us headaches. But we need to learn to use them correctly. They clarify our writing by breaking information into chunks and providing pauses for the reader. They add rhythm to our writing, like the spaces between musical notes. Without pauses, no rhythm. Did you notice the pause as I read this line? Commas are so important that they can seriously change the meaning of your writing. You can make one suggestion with a comma. Let's eat, Grandma. If you forget the comma in this particular sentence, let's eat Grandma. You may have unintentionally suggested cannibalism. In this video, I will give you the key comma rules and some tips to help you remember them. I will talk about how commas are used with clauses, words or word groups in a series of 3 or more items, parenthetical expressions or sentence interrupters, dates, addresses, and degrees, and how commas are used with direct quotations. Here's a brief review of a couple of terms before we go on. If you want to review additional grammar terminology, see my video on the parts of speech. We will start with how commas work with larger chunks of words, clauses. This is the longest section, but don't worry. After this, the rules will be much simpler. A clause can be a part of a sentence or an entire sentence. It is a group of words with its own subject and verb. An independent clause can stand on its own, often ends in a period. A sentence will always be made up of at least one independent clause. Unfinished ideas can't stand alone and are therefore dependent clauses. They depend on more information to make sense. In fact, they depend on an independent clause. Let's look at this sentence that you may remember from the parts of speech video. Because the exhausted squad was outside the wire for 3 days, they collapsed when they returned to their comfortable beds. They collapsed when they returned to their comfortable beds is an independent clause, a thought that stands on its own. Because the exhausted squad was outside the wire for 3 days is dependent because it doesn't state a complete thought without further information. When clauses are combined, there is usually a word that links them called a conjunction. When there is a conjunction joining clauses, there will need to be a comma, whether the clause is dependent or independent. There is one exception. When the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, you usually don't need a comma, as I will show you in a moment. There are 2 types of conjunctions, coordinating and subordinating. A coordinating conjunction is a transition or linking word that joins 2 independent clauses. The most common ones are and but. Use the comma before the coordinating conjunction, as you can see in this example. There was not enough to eat on the march, but at least there was plenty of clean water. A subordinating conjunction is a transition word that indicates a time, place, or cause and effect relationship. It ties the extra and less important information to the independent clause. Some common subordinating conjunctions are if, when, because, and although. If the sentence starts with a dependent clause, which you will recognize from the subordinating conjunction, put the comma after it, as in this example. Because there was not enough to eat, they drank a lot of water. But remember this important exception. If the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, you don't need the comma, as you see here. They drank a lot of water because there was not enough to eat. Use a comma between words or word groups in a series of 3 or more items. For example, he is a quiet, analytical, and respected commander. Sometimes you also need a comma when you only have 2 adjectives. If you could use the conjunction and between the 2 adjectives and the result still makes sense, add the comma. Let's try using this rule. He is a quiet and analytical commander. So use the comma. Also use a comma before and after certain introductory words which indicate a list is coming. Words such as namely, that is, i.e., e.g., and for example when they are followed by a series of items. Let's use this comma-abundant sentence to review what I have talked about so far. Even though they brought only the necessities, namely sleeping bags, MREs, tents, warm clothes, etc., their packs were heavy. Here you begin with a dependent clause. This requires a comma when it is at the beginning of a sentence. Next, you have the introductory word namely. Then you have a list of items. Finally, you come to an independent clause. Use two commas when you have an interruption in the sentence, meaning you have a phrase with extra but not essential information for the complete thought. These words or phrases, by the way, can include a person's name. They also include words that introduce a sentence like, yes, I think so. This interruption is called a parenthetical expression. Words to look out for include who, which, and that. Just a little tip. We often need to decide whether to use which or that. If you can leave the clause out and still have the sentence make sense, use which. And if you can leave the clause out, use two commas around the clause. If the clause is central to the meaning of the sentence, use that and do not put commas around the clause. For example, here is a core sentence. The barracks were hot in the Arizona summer. Now I will elaborate. The barracks, which were built in 1940, were hot in the Arizona summer. Since the phrase in the second example doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, it begins with which and is offset by commas. Compare this sentence to, the barracks that were hot in the summer were in Arizona. This sentence has a slightly different meaning than the first. It means there are more than one set of barracks, but the specific ones we are talking about are in Arizona. Since the clause that were hot in the summer is essential to the meaning of the sentence, it begins with that and is not offset by commas. A statement of contrast can also be a parenthetical expression. It was her intuition, not her training, which helped her understand the situation. If two parts of a sentence contrast sharply with one another, you can think of that as an interrupter too. It is my turn, not yours. Use a comma to separate the day of the month from the year. And, what most people forget, always put one after the year also. Here's an example. It was in the Times, the August 18th, 2017 edition. No comma is necessary for just the month and year, as you see here. It was in an August 2017 article. Use a comma to separate the city from the state and have another comma after the state. He is from Minneapolis, Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes. Use commas between all elements of an address except zip code. He lived at 5476 Uland Street, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 57886. There is no comma before the zip code, but remember what I just said. You do need a comma after the state if no zip code comes after it. Fort Huachuca is located in Sierra Vista, Arizona, a small town surrounded by mountains. When a degree or title comes after a person's name, frame it with commas. George Doolittle, MD, is arriving by helicopter. Use commas for introducing or interrupting direct quotations. For example, terrorism, he said, is part of daily life in many places. Or, he said, terrorism is a part of daily life in many places. Here's a tip. If a quotation is a question, use the question mark instead of the comma, as you will see in the following sentence. I can go, can't I? She asked. I will cover more about quotation rules in a different video. As you have seen, there are a few rules that will help you use commas correctly. The main thing to remember is that a comma creates a slight pause for the reader between parts of a sentence. Commas are important because you probably won't be present to answer questions on what you have written. Remember the Army writing style. Your goal is to ensure your audience will understand what you wrote in a single, rapid reading. If what you wrote is difficult to understand, it may not even get read. Most of this video is about where commas are needed, but as you can see in this example, you also need to be careful not to overuse commas. Your writing will be clear or muddy depending on how well you group and separate words, phrases, and clauses. See you next time.